Hello, everybody, and welcome to another week of the JavaScript Marathon. If you were here with us last week, welcome back. If this is your first week here with us, welcome to JavaScript Marathon, an entire free month of workshops and trainings on React, on Vue, on Angular, on web performance, on RxJS, and a lot of other topics. So we're so glad that you could be here. Today, we're going to be talking about Gatsby, an introduction to Gatsby here on the React track. And let's dive right in. Let's dive in as soon as my slides advance. There we go. So first of all, my name is Rob Ocel. I'm a software architect here at this.labs. If you would like to reach out to me, if you have any questions about this topic, or if you'd like to discuss anything that you see here today even further, you can find me on Twitter at RobOcel. So it's just my name spelled a little funny. I wish I could change my Twitter handle to my actual name, but unfortunately, an advertising bot has stolen it. So I keep the joke that I made when Twitter first started. So at RobOcel, if you'd like to reach out to me. Before we get started, we'd like to talk about a couple of our sponsors. So the first sponsor is this.labs. This.labs are your partners in modern digital transformation. We specialize in mentorship, consulting, training, and staff augmentation for enterprise organizations. You can find out more at this.labs.com or send us an email at hi@this.co. Along those lines, do you find yourself trying to keep up constantly with evolving technology, and do you find that to be a struggle? Do you want to bring your team up to speed on any of the latest technologies? This.labs offers personal training programs to suit your organizational needs, ensuring you and your company stay on the leading edge. Contact us today at hi@this.co to set up your complimentary needs assessment. We'd also like to bring attention to a couple of our upcoming events. So tune in every second Thursday of the month for React Online. For those of you that are keeping score at home or watching this live, that's actually tomorrow, April 9th at 3:30 Eastern Daylight Time. This month, we have Pablo Navarez talking about micro frontends, and we have Eric Rasmussen, the creator of Redux Form and React Final Form, talking about modern forms in React. This.'s online meetups are an amazing opportunity for developers and enthusiasts alike to engage with the global tech community no matter where they are. So if you'd like to get the link to that, just like you did today, you can actually register on the site reactjsmeetup.com. Similarly, on every third Thursday of the month, we have our Vue Meetup online, which you can sign up on vuemeetup.com. This month, we're going to be having Evan Yu, the creator of Vue, and Torsten Lundberg, who's on the core team, is going to be giving a talk as well. And last week, we had the Angular Meetup online. So you might have missed it last week, or maybe you saw it. You can see it on YouTube if you'd like to. But next month, on the first Thursday of the month, we'll have our Angular Meetup online. And again, if you're interested in that, you can look it up on angularmeetup.com. Our next sponsor today is Fauna. FaunaDB, the database built for serverless, featuring native GraphQL. Add a full-featured global data store to your app in minutes. Access effortlessly from the browser and from mobile. Never again worry about data correctness, capacity, redundancy, latency, or availability. Today, they're offering you a generous free tier, so give it a try. And you can do that, find that trial at the link below, which is bit.ly/Fauna free tier. And finally, our final sponsor today is Syncfusion. They provide the ready-to-use enriched UI React components like grid, chart, and schedule. They deliver high professional themes that suit your application. And also, you're able to create your own themes using the Theme Studio. Based on the application suite, the Syncfusion components provide an easy way of customization and flexible options within the Syncfusion React component. They have better support with individual demos for every feature within the component. Syncfusion React components are written in TypeScript with 0 dependencies. The Syncfusion React UI components help to build a complicated front-end web or mobile app from powerful, fast rendering templates, HTTP services, dependency injection, data management, form handling, and so on. They support all modern web browsers with mobile responsiveness and touch-friendly gestures, and you can find more at syncfusion.com. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here again today. Today, we're going to be talking about Gatsby. Gatsby is such a really cool topic. It's been around for quite a while now, surprisingly enough, and it has just been getting more and more popular. And we're just so glad that everybody was here to show some interest in kind of getting introduced to it or learning a little bit more about it. So let's talk about today's goals. The goals today are to talk about the basics of the Gatsby architecture. So we're going to be just sort of describing a little bit about how it works, some of the phrases and terms we're going to be hearing as we discuss Gatsby. We're going to just very briefly touch on the idea of GraphQL, which is going to be very important to the concepts of Gatsby. GraphQL itself is a massive topic. We're actually going to have, I think, some GraphQL talks later in the JavaScript Marathon, so you should definitely look into those if you're interested. We're going to start a new Gatsby project using the Gatsby CLI and see how easy it is to actually get started building our first websites. We're going to add some features to that project, and then we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of static sites and dynamic behavior and what you can and can't do with Gatsby. And a little hint there, you can do pretty much anything you want to. So why Gatsby? Why is Gatsby interesting? Why are we talking about Gatsby at all in this track? Well, I remember first seeing a talk about Gatsby in late 2017 at a local meetup, a talk given by a local developer named Ben McCormick. And I was super impressed by the talk that he gave. I actually was watching it from that early on. Then in June of 2019, I was able to sit down with one of the This.Labs developers, Frederick Preck, and I did a series on using Gatsby with Netlify, and we were super interested in it and had a lot of fun doing that. And that was even a year ago. So even just going back and rewatching those videos from not even a year ago, it's amazing to see how much Gatsby has changed since 2017 to 2019 and now into 2020. Gatsby itself is a funded startup that's gotten over $15 million in funding in late 2019. So it's a really growing team. It's a dynamic team. There's just a lot of push behind it. The team and the team members are all amazing. Really love including their documentation team, which is led by their head of learning, Marcy Sutton. And this amazing team is just paving the way for all sorts of new features, including embracing React hooks, which we'll see later, and the accessibility of both the software and the documentation. So they're really just trying to make Gatsby not just this site or this tool that you use to build blogs, which is what a lot of people used it for when it first came out, but instead to be kind of this amazing platform or framework for building really cool sites built with a lot of interesting behaviors and a lot of just out-of-the-box improvements. So, I kind of mentioned some of the benefits, but, obviously performance is one of the big reasons why we're talking about Gatsby. You get some of the benefits of static rendering, server-side rendering, and static rendering to get a lot of performance optimizations right out of the box. And it does even more than that when you start bringing in concepts like the plugins. So you can get all sorts of really cool plugins like the image plugin and things like that, which are going to do performance optimizations on images that you include in your website. And you don't even have to understand how a lot of those things are working right away. You just get them, again, right out of the box. And one of the reasons why I'm super excited about technology like this is the developer experience. So, I think one of the challenges that people have is when you try to not use a framework, or one of the reasons why frameworks are so successful for bringing people into web development is just because they really help you reuse your code. They help make sense of things which are complicated. They help you really isolate a lot of complexity that maybe you don't have quite as clearly if you're just writing vanilla JavaScript or basic HTML and CSS. Something like Gatsby lets you still have a website which is comprised primarily of HTML and CSS, but you could even develop it using these frameworks or these tools or using React, which might be more ergonomic to you. It might be easier for you to do, but then you get the advantages of that ultimately turning into HTML and CSS. So you get kind of the performance benefits. You don't pay a lot of the costs of modern frameworks, but you get the benefits of the developer experience that these frameworks give you. And of course, the features and plugins. So one of the big things here too is if everybody can see that, I don't like necessarily referring to the state of JavaScript too widely. I don't like to treat it as gospel. But if you look at the results for Gatsby, which they've only really tracked for the last year, you can see that there's actually a lot of people interested in it. A lot of people that have used it that want to use it again in the future, and a lot of people that haven't had a chance to use it that really want to use it. So there is still a lot of excitement about it and a lot of adoption ready to, a lot of people ready to get into this and try it out. So there's still just a ton of growth here. So when we talk about what Gatsby is, I took this picture directly from their main website because I think it's really indicative of what of how Gatsby is structured and how you should think about it when we start looking at the code. So what you can see here is that the idea of Gatsby is to take data from multiple different data sources. Here they're talking about CMSs like Contentful or WordPress, or just Markdown, or just text files that you have in your file structure, or data from APIs or databases or whatever else that you have available. And what's going to happen is that Gatsby is going to look at that data, those data sources, take that data down and sort of process it into something that we're going to call nodes. And so it's going to take all these disparate data sources, process them down into these node chunks. It's going to pull those nodes into a GraphQL database, basically, put it behind a GraphQL API. And then you're going to be able to access that GraphQL API or all that data from all those data sources at build time inside of your pages and your templates that you're building inside your website. So what Gatsby is really doing is it's taking the code that you're writing, it's combining it with the data that you've given it, and then it's spitting out these statically generated HTML, CSS files, and including some JavaScript files that then execute your site. You then host all those files online, and then people will download that site. They'll get a statically rendered version of the page that they landed on. And if there is any additional dynamic behavior that has to be booted up, that all gets loaded once the initial page comes down. And it's called rehydrating the app, right? This is where you might have heard hydration concept. So it rehydrates, or it turns on all the dynamic JavaScript and React features of your site, if there are any. And it has some performance optimizations right underneath the hood to kind of help you do some trickery of routing to get really fast, responsive websites. Now, GraphQL, again, just a page on this. We're going to be talking about GraphQL, and GraphQL is core to the concepts of Gatsby, but you do not need to be an expert in GraphQL. There's a couple things that are true about the documentation for Gatsby and the support for GraphQL, which is that a lot of the plugins that you're probably going to be using to build the site that you're going to be building, a lot of these plugins connect to a lot of the data sources that you might already know about, things like Contentful or WordPress or Markdown files. A lot of these have amazing documentation that you can use to easily reproduce the GraphQL queries that you need, and then sort of play around with them a little bit from that. That said, if the GraphQL syntax is entirely jarring to you, there is a visual explorer, which we'll talk about, and there is a ton of documentation that can just get you in the door on GraphQL. That documentation is both on the Gatsby website and on the GraphQL website. And so again, we're not going to go deeply into the syntax of GraphQL right now. Or in this talk, you're going to see me sort of copy paste some GraphQL queries, and we'll talk about them a little bit. But we're going to touch on this, and then if you have any further questions, you can look that up online. So I want to talk really quickly before we start on this idea of nodes. So I talked earlier about this idea of nodes. And this idea that you have all these data sources, right? You might keep your information in text files or in Markdown files or on APIs, or you might keep it in a CMS like Contentful or WordPress. And you have all this data, all this dynamic data that's being edited and maintained in a bunch of different places. And you want to get that into your build system so you can actually use that inside of your Gatsby templates. And that idea is going to be this idea of nodes, right? So you can take things like images, files, CMS entries, or APIs, and turn those into like these little nodes inside of your inside of your system. So I'll pause here for a second because there's a question about whether or not the build process is going to crawl your entire WordPress archives. I don't believe that's true. To be honest, I don't know that I've used the WordPress plugin specifically, but I have to imagine that it's going to give you control over which elements of WordPress that you expose to it. If anybody else knows or has used the WordPress plugin specifically for Gatsby that has an answer for that, I can't imagine. I have to imagine that you have control over where you apply it. And certainly if the question still exists, if it's not answered later, we can look at the documentation if there's some time left over at the end. So again, these nodes are created from all these disparate data sources, okay? And these nodes get ingested by Gatsby into the GraphQL system that it's running and hidden behind an API. And again, that gets fed into your sort of your build process. And so your build process talks about this idea of pages. And there's a couple different ways that you can create pages in your application, right? These are actually going to be statically rendered pages. They're going to be routes in your application also. One of the ways that you can do this is by putting files into the actual pages directory, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You can also have plugins that you install that will actually make pages for you. And the last one is that you can actually arbitrarily create pages from the existing nodes in your GraphQL storage by implementing an API in the Gatsby node file, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But basically, the idea is that you take all these nodes, and then you can run them through some sort of function, some sort of mapping function, and ultimately connect them either with templates or just with raw output and produce these pages. And those pages are going to be what's ultimately put out from your build process and what you're going to store online, what you're going to host, and ultimately those are going to be your routes that your users are going to be on as well. Another concept which you're going to see a lot today, if you've looked up any documentation about Gatsby you've seen before, it's this idea of plugins, themes, and starters. So the Gatsby community is amazing. There's a gigantic community that's growing all the time of people that are just building really cool things that connect into Gatsby and then sharing them with other people. And so when you're joining and building your site with Gatsby, you're not starting from scratch. You're actually standing on the shoulders of all the Gatsby developers that have come before you and that have been willing to share their work. So a lot of what you do when you're building out these sites is you can be looking for functionalities that exist already in the repositories of plugins, themes, and starters. And so just the idea of plugins is ideally a piece of code or a functionality that somebody develops that hooks into one or more of the Gatsby APIs to deliver additional features. So this can be a new way to create nodes, right? A new way to ingest data from a different source. It can be a new way to create pages, so a way to take existing nodes and turn those into pages. Or they can add additional functionalities. It can change the way that your pages server-side render. It can change the way that a lot of these different processes work, right? So any way that you connect into or change the way that Gatsby's build process or its generation process operates, those are going to be plugins. The next is themes. So themes are like little modules that they add to your application. What's interesting is they actually get to define their own little configuration file, which means that they can bring in their own sets of plugins as well. And you just sort of bring them in as like an entire module that might add like a blog or whatever else to your application. We're not going to talk about themes today, but they are an interesting topic and they are distinct from starters and plugins. Starters are going to be collections of plugins and a whole structure of files that kind of get you going, right? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a place where you start from. There is a default Gatsby template, which we'll be looking at, but then there are a bunch of starters, and we'll look at those later, that bring in their own collections of plugins, and maybe they lay out the file structure in such a way that you get a lot of, saves you a lot of time on setup, so you can just immediately start implementing your website. Okay, so that's going to be it for this intro piece. Okay, I just wanted to introduce a couple concepts, a couple words, because as we're actually looking at the code, we're going to be touching on these phrases and these concepts, and I want to have at least introduced them once so that when you hear them again later, you know that those phrases and those words are intentional and they actually mean something important. So if you give me just a moment here, if anybody has any other questions. I see there's a question about whether those functions work similarly to GraphQL resolvers. Unfortunately, I've lost the context for that question. I'm wondering if you're wondering about the pages idea. I think that's different. Both the node idea, how you ingest the data source, and also the pages concept, I think are a little different from those resolvers. But we're actually going to see an example of the generation of pages and the generation of nodes. So when we get there, you might be able to see that directly in context. Okay, so I'm going to move over and start sharing my actual screen. And we'll start looking at some code. All right. So here we are at my terminal, and I kind of have us ready. So one of the things that you can do, and this is one thing that we love at this dot about helping people get into web development, is we absolutely love CLIs. We just think CLIs are great in terms of helping people do the right things, not make mistakes, and just get into a well set up situation, right? So we love CLIs. So if you want to install the Gatsby CLI, you can install it globally. You can use NPM or Yarn, your call. I think I talked about this last week. I know I'm doing the React track, but unfortunately I learned NPM and I work in a lot of other areas. I tried Yarn and I've gone back to NPM. So apologies if you are a big Yarn fan. I don't hate you, but I use NPM. So after you've installed that globally, you can access it by using the Gatsby command. And you can see here that if you just do Gatsby, it's going to give you some ideas of some commands. So the develop command runs the development server. You can do a build. You can serve a previous build, et cetera, et cetera. But what we want to do is this Gatsby new command down here to create a new project. So we're going to do Gatsby new. Now you see the first thing is a root path. So I mean, that's just basically what we're going to call this thing. So I'm going to call it JS Marathon Gatsby. And the next place is I have room to give a starter. Now we're not going to talk about starters exactly right now, so I'm not going to use one by default. This is just going to be the baseline, and it's installing this whole thing. Okay. A lot of you have scaffolded projects, maybe with Create React App or anything along those lines. It's very similar, okay? And when it's finished, it's going to give you some commands on how to get going with that. Now, in the interest of time, I've already done that just to make sure, just in case my internet, well, if my internet went down, I guess this whole stream would go down. But just in case for some reason I lost connection to the NPM registry, I already have that installed. And we can start here. So when you scaffold a new project with Gatsby, this is basically where you're going to start. Okay, this is what you are given right off the bat. And I know that this can be somewhat intimidating to people the first time that they see it, but it's actually pretty straightforward, and it's actually really cool how it works. So let's just look at what we have here. We have a basic, prettier configuration. We have our basic package file. And if we look into our package file, we can see that even the basic Gatsby implementation brings in some things. It brings in the basic framework, Gatsby. It also brings in additionally some plugins already, right? So we have the Gatsby image plugin. We have, or library. We have the Gatsby plugin manifest, the offline plugin, the React helmet, Sharp, etc. So there's already a bunch of plugins that are already implemented or at least included in the basic Gatsby repository that's created from the CLI. Next, we're going to go into the second, probably most important thing in a Gatsby project, which is the config file, so Gatsby config. Now, Gatsby config is really cool because this is a really straightforward way to implement and to enact and to set up all of your plugins and just your overall site. So this first piece is site metadata. This is basically some static information about your site that is going to be used throughout the application. So you have your title of your site, your description, and your author. And that can be pulled in as, this is going to be pulled in as one of those nodes in our GraphQL data setup, right? So we're going to have a site metadata node on top of all the other nodes that we can then use to build pages in the future. And if you look here, we have plugins like the Gatsby React helmet plugin. Basically, this is a plugin that helps control what goes into like the head elements of your page, setting up meta tags and titles and things along those lines. Then we have the Gatsby source file system. What this is the plugin that generates nodes. There's a convention in Gatsby for the plugins that do this that includes source. So you can have Gatsby source Instagram, Gatsby source contentful, Gatsby source file system. So this is a way to generate nodes in your GraphQL data for files on your file system. And what we can see here is that particularly this is processing images. So it's giving this a name of images, and it's looking for all of the files in source images. Okay. Then we have Transformer Sharp and Plugin Sharp. The Sharp plugins, which are doing some image stuff, and then we have a plugin manifest, which is doing some additional work. And over here, you can do the plugin offline if you want to do progressive web app offline functionality. Again, they do a really good job with these starters of doing documentation inline. So as you're setting up these applications, you can get to that. It's a great question, Chris. We can actually talk about the helmet component in a little bit. We're going to look into the implementation of it as well as how we use it. So that's Gatsby config. Then the other ones are ones which are going to be empty for now. So Gatsby browser, Gatsby node, and Gatsby SSR. Now what's interesting, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but when I first learned about Gatsby, I thought Gatsby node meant like APIs that were running on a server, like Node.js. And my understanding of this is that these are actually, Gatsby node is a file where you hook into the APIs related to node generation and page generation. So later, we're going to add something here that's going to be helping us process some Markdown. Server-side rendering is going to be, that's what SSR stands for. Server-side rendering is going to be a place where we can hook into the server-side rendering APIs. We will not get to this directly, but there are a lot of plugins that affect this. And you can do things like change the way that certain things will render on the site when they're being built. Browser are sort of like things that you want to do with the browser APIs. Generally, this tends to be things like affecting styles, importing style sheets, or other things which are affecting Gatsby's browser APIs. Again, each of these, there might not be time to go into each of these in depth, but there's always links to the documentation. You can go poke around and see what those APIs are. What is important is that to build a Gatsby site, and even to get really deep into building a Gatsby site, right? Like you could build an entire successful Gatsby website and not have to actually implement code in here that wasn't given to you by somebody. Okay, as I said before, there's a great community of people building plugins and doing all sorts of documentation that help give you the snippets of code that you need to include in these files to enable certain features. It's very unlikely that when you are first starting out that you're going to need to have to augment these files. Now, if you're going to come in and you're going to use Gatsby to build your corporate website or a really important or a really large or really complicated web app, then you're going to get to know these files very deeply and to a significant degree, because it's going to be very important in how you separate out the behaviors which are at build time from the behaviors which are at runtime. And again, you'll get into that more. In the source folder, we have 3 folders that exist off the bat. The first is images. There's one that's called components, and there's one that's called pages. Now, Gatsby is really big on this idea of convention over configuration. This is really popular like in Ember. It's kind of gone away a bit, but it's coming back in some things. Like I think Next is really good with this, and a couple other frameworks or libraries work this way, where this pages folder is actually magical in the sense of anything that's put inside this pages folder is going to be automatically generated as a output HTML page. It's also going to be a route in your final system. So you can see by default we have 404, which is we have the ability to set our not found. We have an index, so we have an index, basically an index.html file, and we have a page2 HTML file. Okay, and so each of these files, like if you look at this file right now, the only thing that you see that's really sort of unusual is this link, which comes from Gatsby. So you have this built-in link component in Gatsby, which is going to help do its hooking into the router. I believe under the hood, their documentation says they use reach router, but I'm assuming that they're eventually going to switch when that migration or the merge is completely finished between the router systems. But I think right now the documentation says that they use reach router underneath the hood. But this link will kind of tie into that. So they use this link component to go to a different website. But otherwise, I mean, this is just a React component, right? I mean, that's what's really cool about Gatsby is that ultimately you are just writing React. And if you were here last week, you know that I was saying that when you learn React, you're ultimately just using HTML, CSS plus some additional stuff. You can build a basic HTML, CSS page in React. You can build a basic React application in Gatsby. Okay, you can make it as dynamic as your normal React apps are, but just know that the more dynamic you make your React application, the less you're leveraging from Gatsby. So again, you want to use the right tool for the right job, but I think that even in very dynamic websites, Gatsby still has a strong case to be made for using it, because ultimately for performance, a lot of sites have a lot of static content that would benefit from being statically rendered, if not server-side rendered, to help give people that sort of fast initial page load, and then have the application bootstrap underneath it, behind it, so that then people have all that interactivity, but they get that stuff, they see stuff right away. All that static content comes down right away. Okay, so give me just one moment. I lost one of my windows. Okay, there we go. All right, so this is our structure. Now in our components folder, I forget if this is actually a magical folder or not, but generally the components folder is the place where you put your non-pages. So you're gonna have a lot of React components which are not themselves gonna be routes, they're gonna be pieces of other things. You can put that inside your components folder. So we have here a header, we have the image, which is a wrapper around that. We have the layout, which is just sort of a generic way to lay the page out with a header, a footer, etc. And the SEO component. Now when we look at these components, you're gonna see for the first time some of our GraphQL. So you can see that this SEO component uses this custom React hook called useStaticQuery, which comes from Gatsby. This static query should be a hint that this is going to be a build time thing. So this is serving to help the server-side rendering more so than the live behavior of the page. And this static query is going to make a GraphQL query. That's what this is basically saying. And then we're using the backticks to give us a fancy string. And here we're saying we're going to make a query on the site and the site metadata. So remember that site metadata that was in our config file, which is one of our nodes. This is querying that node. And from that node, it's getting the title, the description, and the author. And that's going to be returned to us as this property site. This is actually the hookup to the helmet, yep. So down here, this SEO piece is going to be doing the helmet, and it's setting all these meta tags. Okay, some of those things it's pulling from the site metadata. So that's what's really cool, right? It's pulling this static content from the nodes. It's making a GraphQL query using a custom hook, and in the time when this is server-side rendered, it's going to then use that data to satisfy the needs of this page, and then produce the output from there. That's basically the way that we can understand it. Okay, so let's take a peek at what this site actually looks like. So we're going to do a Gatsby serve. Oh, no. Sorry. Gatsby develop, excuse me. We serve later. So we're doing Gatsby develop, and basically what it's doing is it's running through an entire life cycle of events. It's, again, looking through our plugins, it's processing our nodes, it's generating our views. Now, to some extent, some of that is happening in a magical way here. It's not going through the entire build process. We're not going to actually see the HTML files, I think, here, but it's building something that's equivalent to it. And so we can actually, I open that up in the wrong browser. So what we can see is if we go to localhost 1000, this is what the site looks like by default. Okay, so this is where all of you will be when you create your site. And it came with a link to go to page 2. Now notice it's actually making a real route change. And if I go to page 2, it'll bootstrap, give me static content for that route, and then bootstrap the application. And it's different if I go here. And yeah, so that's basically it, right? So we're done. We got a Gatsby site. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. We're done. No, let's do something kind of interesting for it. Let's start adding some content to this site. And we'll start in the direction that I think a lot of people go down when they start with Gatsby, and that's to add like some blog posts and some Markdown, right? So when you're first trying to figure out how to add content to your Gatsby site, you might just be a little bit confused. You're like, okay, so I need data, right? So I need the ability to see blog posts. I need the ability to have blog data. And again, you can decide how your blog data is going to be sourced. In this case, we're going to do it with Markdown, right? This is a classic way to start a Gatsby site. And when you, here we go. When you actually search for this kind of stuff, you get to, again, the really great documentation of Gatsby, which walks you through this process. And so we're going to walk through this documentation together to kind of show you how you would look for information, how you would find it in the documentation, how you would add it to your Gatsby site, and process that. So when we're adding Markdown pages, first, we're going to make sure that we have the Gatsby source file system. Now, if you recall, we already have this in our base template, so we don't actually need to do this. The second is that we need to actually start processing nodes, right? So again, remember the file system plugin is going to look for files on our computer and then turn those into nodes in our system for our build process. So what we're going to do is we're just going to copy this code for the file system into our Gatsby config. And I'm going to put it up here at the top. So it's in line here. And notice it's Markdown pages, and it's looking for source Markdown pages. Now, this is not magical. I can call this whatever I want, right? I can call this blog post, right? I can do whatever I want here, but I'm not going to. I'm going to leave it as Markdown. And whoopsies, whoops, come back. OK, so we're going to make a folder here called Markdown pages. OK, and this is kind of getting one step ahead. But we're going to do this because we know we're going to be reading all the files in Markdown pages and turning them into Markdown pages. So we're going to do that now. Moving down, we're going to see that we need the Gatsby Transformer Remark plugin. Now, this transformer is going to be something that's going to take nodes. In this case, it's going to take Markdown nodes, and it's going to run a transformation on them to turn them from Markdown into HTML. And then we're going to be able to apply those transformations to a template to actually produce pages. Okay. So first, we need to take this command, the install save, and add this to our system. So Gatsby install, npm install save Gatsby Transformer Remark, and that's going to add that plugin, the Remark plugin. So that's I think Remark is a Markdown parsing tool for turning Markdown into HTML. So it's somewhat proprietary based on that library. There could be other Markdown parsers that you might want to use in the future. I think MDX has a plugin of their own as well. So you're not bound to this particular one, but this is a common one. OK, so it's now implemented. So we're going to go back and see what the next is. The next is that we have to add that transformer remark to our system. So we're going to go and add it. Let's add to the bottom, it's fine. So we'll just add it here. Now, you notice that some of these plugins are just text. Some of these plugins are objects. There's no magic here. Basically, the idea is if you don't need to pass options, you can just pass a string. If you want to define certain options for your plugin, then you turn it into an object with resolve, the name of that string, and options, an object which has those options. I think the remark transformer has some options, but we can use the defaults, which is reasonable. So we just include it as a string here. And that basically says, use your default options. We're not going to do anything else. All right. So now moving down, we're going to add a Markdown file to our Markdown pages. We'll call this, here we are. Let's add one here. Let's call it first. And we're going to put in some Markdown. Now, this is a Markdown syntax, front matter. It's basically adding some metadata to our Markdown. You don't have to do this. Again, the way that we're going to turn these Markdown pages into nodes and then from nodes into pages is going to rely on this metadata, but you don't need to use it. You can define a different mechanism for describing this, okay? You can do whatever you want, but if you want to use this as a mechanism, it's very common. So here we're going to define a path. Now what's interesting is this is going to be the path of the actual blog. So it's going to be my first post. You know, we can change the date if we want. Okay. And, you know, call it JavaScript Marathon 1. And, you know, we can put any Markdown we want here. This is a title, and this is a subtitle, and here's a link to Google, and maybe we want to put there and say that this goes to Google, right? So it's just your traditional, Markdown syntax. We can save it. So the next is we need to actually create a way to take that node, and that node is going to get turned into HTML. And when that HTML then needs to be a page, but like, how will it know what I want my blog page to look like, right? It can't know that by itself, or at least it wouldn't be useful for a plugin to make those decisions for me. So instead, what we do is we create our own template. And we're going to do this with another convention, another magical page, another magical folder called templates, which defines a place where we put our templates. And we're going to call this a blog post template. Oops, JS6 is fine. And I'm just going to paste what they gave me. Now let's walk through and see what we have here. So if you look, we have a traditional React component. Right now it's called template. And it's going to take some data. So here's the page query, okay? So let's understand this GraphQL query. So this query is going to accept as an input the path. Now this path is going to be given to it by Gatsby on the path it's trying to generate. And it's going to look through the nodes of Markdown Remark. That's just the name of the node collection that the Remark plugin created, Markdown Remark. We're going to be looking for those that have a front matter. That's that metadata, where the path in that metadata is equal to the path that I'm given. In other words, I want to find the blog that's related to the path I'm trying to build right now. Okay. From that, I want to get the HTML. So in other words, what HTML was generated by processing the Markdown. Then I want to pull out that metadata. So I want to get the date, I want to get the path, I want to get the title. Other people might use things like how long will this take to read. There's a lot of other metadata that's included in the general front matter that Remark can handle. But for now, we're just dealing with these. Okay. So this is the data that's going to fuel our template. This HTML, this date, this path, this title. And that's what we see up here. So we see that the data that we're getting into this template is going to be have the Markdown Remark in it, the front matter, and the HTML. And we're going to, in the blog post, have an H1 that has the title, an H2 that has the date. And then we're going to have a div, which dangerously sets the inner HTML. Don't be too scared. Gains or say sets the inner HTML to the actual HTML of the blog post. Now again, if you want to break your blogs up in different ways, have custom styling for certain parts, you can make this as arbitrarily complex of a template as you want, but this will at least let us see what it is we're trying to do. Okay. So the next is we have nodes, we have the template, but we actually have to define how to connect those two things to each other. And we're going to do that by adding things in the Gatsby Nodes section. So let's do that. And we can just add it here. Now let's look at what we've added. So we've required path. And what we're doing is we're resolving this template. Now, did we call it blog template? No, we called it blog post. So we're going to update that. And we call it JSX, not JS. So we've resolved this path to get the template. Okay, that's going to give us the actual template, the template function. And the actions, which again, this is just the normal API. So this create pages API is a Gatsby API for how we turn nodes into pages. So it's going to be looking for things like this. It's going to call them to give these plugins or our code a chance to create pages from the existing nodes. So after all the nodes are generated, this gets called and we can create pages. And so what it's going to do is it's going to find the template. Then it's going to execute a GraphQL command. And here it's going to do all Markdown remarks. So here, this is a different collection, which has all of the Markdown files, all the Markdown nodes in it, excuse me, in order of descending order of date. So I guess from newest to oldest. And it'll take 1,000. So you can do pagination here, whatever you want to do to limit this to certain outcomes and not other outcomes, whatever you want to do. And then here, we have to navigate the edges. We'll kind of explore the structure of this. But basically the results of all Markdown remark are edges. Each of those edges has a cursor, but it also has a node. The node is going to be the data. In that node, we have front matter, because again, these are going to be Markdown files. We'll have processed the front matter. And in that front matter, we need the path. So that's how you read that. Of all the Markdown nodes we've created, we want to get from them the front matter, the metadata. And from that metadata, we want to extract the path. That's basically what we want here. That's this result. So we're going to then, against that result, navigate all these edges. And for every one of these edges, for every one of the nodes in every one of those edges, we're going to then call create page, which is a Redux action, which is going to actually build a page. The path for that page is going to be the path that was specified in the metadata. The component that is going to be applied to that node to produce the page is the blog post template. And you can have some additional context of which we're not going to need it. I'll pause here for a second. So the screen was not in focus. Hopefully me stopping for a second has brought it into focus. Okay. I also need to save this config file. Okay. So let's go back and see if there's anything else that we need to do for now. And it doesn't. So now if we execute this, go back to our Gatsby develop. It's now running that. Okay. And if we look at our home page, again, here's our starter page. But now we can go to blog, and we can find my first post. And notice this is our blog. Now, it's a horrifically ugly blog. I will grant you that. But at least it's a start. And we can edit this via that template. We can add all the CSS we want. If we want certain types of blogs which are represented in certain ways and other types of blogs which are represented in other ways, again, we can do all that with the metadata. We can have separate create pages functions to make different types of pages from different types of templates. Again, you can do whatever you want with this as far as editing and changing this. But this was the key thing. We took files on our computer, Markdown files on our computer. We allowed Gatsby to turn those into nodes using the source file system plugin. We then translated those nodes into HTML nodes, right, with the transform remark plugin. And then we turned that HTML node, into actual pages on an actual Gatsby website by defining a template and then a create pages function which combine those things together. It's a remarkably powerful concept, but this is the core idea of Gatsby and how you take data, pull it into your system, then take that data and turn it into actual output. Now, what's cool is, okay, sure, that's why didn't I just put that text in here? But now we can put in another file, second, and add this code in and maybe do my second post and marathon 2, and this is still a title, and this is still a subtitle, and here's a link to Facebook. Not sponsors, by the way. And run this again. I'm not sure why it crashed. I might have saved too early. I have a bad habit of my fingers habitually save like every character. So now that's all we had to do, and now it's literally ingesting all of our blog posts. We could now write as many blog posts as we want. We have to edit no code to do this. This setup is completely functional for our entire blog. Okay? Now let's talk about maybe what we would want to do if we wanted to make a link to all of our blogs. Okay? So that was how we took Markdown pages and turned them into blogs, but now how might we do something a little bit different? Let's go to our pages section and make a new file, and let's call it blogs. And in blogs, we are going to basically, I'm just going to steal a little bit from the home page here. So we're going to do this. We're going to call this blogs. And my blogs. Please read my blogs. OK, and we'll delete all this stuff for now. And what we're going to do is we're going to say that we want an unordered list, and then we want to go over the data. So we know we need some data here, right? We know we need the list of our blogs. Well, how do we get that? Well, we get that by following a very similar result to this. So what if I want this query? And I can come back into my blogs file, and I can then include in from Gatsby, I'm going to need my use static query. Remember seeing use static query from earlier? And here I now need to return this. So I'm fixing this. Instead of it just being a simple return, now I need to actually make it a function. So we have that. So now I can put some code in here. Apparently my editor is disagreeing whether I want 4 spaces or 2. And I'm going to do data equals use static query, and then it's going to take that GraphQL query. Okay? Oop, not this. That. It's going to take this GraphQL query. And now I've brought in some data. So again, I did the same thing that I did when I was building things, but I might actually want some more things. So I might want the path, and I might want the title now. I want some extra pseudocode in there because I need, or pseudo metadata, excuse me. I need some additional metadata. So I've pulled in this static query, and I've gotten this data, and now I can use that data down here. I can do data.allMarkdown remark, which is the name of this node, or this thing here. And then I do .edges, and because again, we're just following down the list. All Markdown remark edges. So the next thing is going to be a collection of nodes. And so I can map over that collection of nodes. So this method is going to take a node, and I want to make a link, which is that Gatsby thing for doing links, to node.frontMatter, because remember, we're just following down, so front matter, oops, not with this capital, .path. And open that link, and then the text in the middle, I want it to be node.frontMatter. Okay, let's fix some of that formatting. Okay, so here we have a link here, and we're taking that, and actually we probably want this to be an li. Oops. li. So now what we've defined is a new page, and because we've put it in the pages section, it's going to be automatically turned into a page on our site called blogs. And it's going to execute this query statically at build time to get the Markdown nodes so that it can generate a static page that has the links to all the blog pages, if we did this right. Okay, it's auto building. So now let's go to blogs. And if we go to blogs now, we see that it links to all of our blogs. And if I added a third, it would be here automatically. If I added a fourth, it would be here automatically. And when I say automatically, I mean whenever the Gatsby build executes again. But regardless, I didn't have to hook anything else up, right? I can write unlimited blogs now, and this page will always be up to date with the latest blogs in the order that I wrote them. Okay. All right. Let's talk about one other feature that people love on blogs, and that is, what if I wanted to add some code, right? And I wanted to have like this code. Let's put the code from Gatsby node in there, right? Let's take that code and let's put it in my blog post. And so I have this code syntax. Now, just by copying it, this 3 backticks, if this Markdown syntax, this 3 backticks is going to just put this code into kind of like a fixed width mode. So, you know, to a degree, it's fine, right? Like, it's not the prettiest thing ever. I could manually style this if I wanted to, or I can go looking for a Gatsby plugin. So I can go to the Gatsby website, to the list of plugins, and I can go, hey, do you guys have any syntax highlighters? And when I do that, I see a whole list of syntax highlighting. And the one that I think is really cool is this Gatsby Remark VS Code. And this Gatsby Remark VS Code plugin is going to actually do syntax highlighting with Remark, which I'm using on my site. And it's going to actually hook into real VS Code themes. So I could use my actual VS Code theme on this website. Now, I'm not going to bother doing too much of that. But first, again, let's scroll down and let's see what we have to do. We npm install this thing. So if we want a plugin, we install the plugin as it says. And you can go searching for all sorts of plugins that do all sorts of things, right? Not just blog stuff. Again, you can build any type of site you want. There's so many plugins out there to do really cool stuff. Like I said, when I was looking at this stuff, I noticed that there's a source plugin for getting Instagram files out, which I just think is so cool. So if you want to pull your Instagram feed and turn those into nodes in your website that are going to be in your build process, you can do that with that plugin. So when we include this, we have all these options, but I'm not going to use any of the options. So instead of including the more complicated version of this, I'm just going to skip that and go directly to Gatsby config. And I'm going to, below the Remark transformer, I'm going to do Remark VS Code. OK? Now, when I do this, and then I go to first, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to write JS here, which is going to mark this as JavaScript. And when I go back, and I execute this, I certainly hope it's running. We can ignore all the errors, the warnings, I hope. And so here we go. Did this? Oh, nope, it did not execute. Why does it not like me? Unhandled rejection, live coding error. What are more of your plugins that changed in the last sentence? Precaution for deleting your sites with no rejection. Shared VSC code block does not exist. What did I mess up? Let's see. Let's try one more time. Still failed. What did I? This is what you get for skipping ahead. All options are optional. Maybe I can't skip this. So let's, oh, I'm sorry. That's what I did wrong. This is actually an interesting scenario where Remark VS Code is not a top-level plugin. Interestingly enough, it is a sub-plugin of Remark. think that's the correct syntax. Let me see. Yeah. So here we go. So plugins themselves can have plugins, and this remark VS Code is a plugin for transformer remark. So it's kind of it's working in that way. Now let's hope that I fix this. Okay. Now when I open this up, ta-da! Syntax highlighting. Okay, and it's looking like, again, the default dark theme in VS Code. If you use, for example, Night Owl, or if you use a light theme, if you're a monster like that, whatever it is that you use, you can make your blog look exactly how the code looks when you edit it, including fonts and ligatures and all that kind of stuff. Super, super cool functionality, and look at how easy it was to enable. Now, what if we want to do syntax post highlighting, right? So what if we only want to show highlight the 3rd line and the 8th and the 9th lines? Now, this plugin will allow this by default, and if you actually go look at wherever I left it, if you look down here, it'll say line highlighting. You can do this. Again, the documentation for these plugins is so good. What we need to do, though, is we need to add this CSS to somewhere to our file. Now, we can add it to our template. We can add it to wherever we want as long as it's loaded. What I'm going to do for now is I'm just going to put it in the layout CSS, which is just the CSS which is in the layout component, which is on every page. And I'm just going to put it here. Now, is this the best place to put it? Probably not, but it works. Now, when we come back into our site, we should see that these lines are highlighted. So super cool, right? I think the 3rd line I highlighted was this one, so it's highlighted an empty line. Well, that's what I get for guessing wrong. But the other lines got highlighted. So you can add, syntax highlighting. How long would this take you to implement on your own blog, right? How long would this take to implement this with an arbitrary library that you find on the web, and then you integrate with whatever you're using for Markdown or your CMS or what have you, right? It might be really complicated. This is the power of Gatsby, is that because all of these data sources get brought to these simple nodes, and those nodes get processed with pages and from templates into pages, you just get so much control and so much compatibility between these different entities to help build your site. Okay. There's one last thing, or two, let's see, maybe I can get to 2 things quick. So there's one other thing that I want to do, which is I want to show you that you can build whatever you want here. And in the interest of time, if you were here last week, you saw me build a dad joke. You saw me build a dad joke tool to learn React. And I'm going to basically take something similar to that, and I'm going to put it here. But I'll explain what I've built. I just don't have time to necessarily re-enter it for this session. But I want to show you that Gatsby does not just need to be static content, right? So far, I've showed you a couple of blogs which were completely static content. Nothing was changing about them. But that doesn't have to be what Gatsby is. You can make a full-fledged modern React application and integrate it with Gatsby so that the static stuff gets generated statically and the dynamic stuff gets turned on later on. So here what I have is I have a page in my page section, which is going to show up as dad joke, the route dad joke by default. That's the convention. And it uses state to save a joke. And then I have an effect that's going to get a dad joke. And it's going to reach out to an API that gives dad jokes. And it's going to pull that dad joke down and store it into state. And over here, when you click a button, you're going to get a dad joke. And you're going to get a dad joke by default. Now, what happens when we run this? Now, you might be like, well, how does it statically build that? Well, it knows which parts of it can be statically built, and it knows which parts of it are dynamic. And for the parts that are static, it builds them statically. And for the parts that are dynamic, it leaves room for them and allows those to turn on and activate as soon as the site goes live. So now if we go back to this site and we go to dad jokes, didn't work. Oh, is it dad joke? What was it? What did I call this? Dad joke. Oh, I put it in component. Whoopsies. Don't do that, right? Conventions are conventions for a reason. Put your files where you actually want them. Okay, rebuilding. Good. Now let's try dad jokes. Dad joke. There we go. Dad joke. So you can see when the page loads up, it has my dad joke, and this dynamic behavior still works. Okay. So the last piece of this all, the part that I want to show you guys, is again evidence that this is actually static rendering, and I haven't just been completely lying to you, and Gatsby is just this snake oil that does nothing and actually just runs everything dynamically. To show you that, I need to actually run another command. So we're going to go execute Gatsby. We're going to look at our list of commands. And what we want to do here is a Gatsby build. So Gatsby build is going to actually, oh, it would help if I spelled it right, Gatsby build. And what this is going to do is run the actual production build. So the develop build is kind of doing some magic where it's storing some stuff in memory because that gives you the live upload. They don't want to have to regenerate HTML files and reload your web browser every time you're doing this. So it's doing a little bit of magic for you in the develop mode. But when we actually run the full build, this is going to do everything for realsies. It's going to actually produce the HTML files. It's going to actually process those nodes in exactly the way that it would be in your static site. In your final site, and I could actually deploy now as a result of this build. But another thing that you can do is you can now Gatsby serve. So I can now serve the thing I just built. So I can actually look at the behavior of my production build. And I want to show you what that looks like. So if you go to 9,000, and then I'm going to go to blogs, blog. First, oh no, I can just go to blogs. Okay, so when I went to blogs and I go in here and I look for blogs, you can see I actually got an actual document. And this document, if I was to open it, this is the document that I actually pulled down from the server. And if you look at it, it's got some Gatsby stuff in it, okay, undeniable. It pulls down some data that helps Gatsby hydrate the application once it's downloaded. But if you look up here, look, here's my data for my site. It's actually an HTML, right? There's no fooling here. This is not generated by React. This is actually what came down from the browser, or from the server, excuse me, the actual HTML. So this is proof that Gatsby is doing what it says it's doing. It is actually rendering these pages statically. And if we want to go and then check last on my dad joke page, what we'll see here when we look is this. Which, again, has that basic data. And here you can see the parts of the site which are static, and the part which is dynamic. So this p tag, if you recall, was going to have the initial joke. That initial joke is the result of this use effect, which is executing the first time this component is actually being mounted, and it's getting that initial joke from the server or from the service. Because that's a dynamic behavior, it's not going to be there in the static rendering of the site. It's not part of the static generation part, so it's going to be skipped. So you can see it comes down. Oops, excuse me. It comes down empty. And then when the website, when Gatsby, again, hydrates the application, it comes online and it connects all of its internals. It then executes the dad joke component, and then that activates the run effect, the use effect, excuse me, that actually makes the call, that gets the joke, and then it synchronizes what came down from the server with what React was trying to build, and it joins those two together, and from there forward, it's a React application. To you, it doesn't seem that way. It seems seamless. It looks like it came down super fast. But this is also one of the ways that Gatsby does performance optimizations, because even though you have statically rendered pages for all your websites, it can do some really cool magic where it comes down statically initially, and then in the background, it starts downloading the rest of the site, and then it can do server-side rendering from there to make it so that your page transitions feel super, super fast. You're just darting from page to page. If you go to a Gatsby site, you might notice this, that it is very fast on navigation. And you're like, ooh, this site is really, really snappy. And it's because it's doing that trick. You get that fast initial load, but then you get the post-initial load benefits of that server side, or excuse me, that client side rendering. So Gatsby is really this great balance between dynamic and static. And I just want you to know that if you have a very dynamic website, you can still use Gatsby. Gatsby is still effective in building those websites because, again, at a minimum, it's just an interesting way for you to get server-side rendering. Now, I wouldn't say that would be the only reason you should use it, but I'm just saying that you can build as dynamic a website as you want in Gatsby, take advantage of the performance optimization it gives you underneath the hood, and then build out your dynamic content. Anything that Gatsby does can be overridden. All right, so we'll be done in just a minute. The last thing that I want to show you guys is to not, because I promised this earlier, which is these plugins. So what's really cool is, again, not only do the plugins have great documentation, but you can dive right into them. And if you actually look at these plugins to see what they're actually doing, for example, here's the helmet plugin. The helmet plugin has one file in it, which is Gatsby SSR. Now remember, we had a Gatsby SSR file in our project. So when you have these plugins, they're just hooking into the same APIs you have access to. That's what the plugins are. And if you look at this, what it's doing is it's exporting an onRender body method. And that onRender body is one of the APIs. So Gatsby is looking for things that are implementing its APIs, and then it calls them at the appropriate time, at the appropriate point in the life cycle. And it gives it some actions, set head components, set HTML attributes, set body attributes. And here you have this helmet render static. This helmet comes from React Helmet. If you look, when you server-side render, or when you render out the helmet, it tells you to do this render static. So it's just following the documentation of React Helmet, and then it's turning that into a Gatsby plugin. So here it's rendering that helmet statically. It's getting out some things from the helmet. And there it's then calling those Gatsby methods that it's giving you here, these Gatsby actions that are affecting things in the Redux that will ultimately change the way that things are produced. And here you're setting these attributes to the HTML attributes, you're setting the body attributes to the body attributes, and here you're setting title, link, meta, no script, style, base. If you want to extend this behavior to do even more things, I think you can certainly do that as well, because you can make your own version of onRender body in the SSR component and make it do arbitrarily whatever you want to give you the extra functionality you need beyond the plugins. So if you go beyond the plugins, don't be afraid, that's great. You can continue to adapt them, change them, continue to help these people maintain them, or fork them and create your own, and then give that back to the community and share as well. Again, that's what makes Gatsby so powerful. It's not just that it's a great framework, which it is. It's not just that it's built by a great team, which it is. It's not that it has awesome documentation, which it does. It's that it also has an awesome community of people that are sharing their code and their learnings with other people. That's what makes the Gatsby community so amazing. Again, that's what makes the web development community so amazing, and that's what gets us excited at this.labs. So thank you, everybody, for coming to this session. Again, if you have any additional questions, or if you have any discussion that you want to, any things that you want to talk about with regarding Gatsby or React or anything, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. If you give me just one moment, I'm just going to conclude with one last slide, which will give you guys one last chance to ask a question if you haven't. Okay. So the last piece was just this. Again, we want to thank you for being here. We want to thank this.for putting this together. If you did find this training helpful and you'd like to learn more, let us know. We'd love to help teach you more. If you're interested in trainings like this or having additional trainings similar to this done at your company, let us know. Reach out to us at hi@this.co, and we can do a complimentary needs assessment to kind of see what trainings might be useful to you and your team. So again, thank you, everybody, for coming to this session of the JavaScript Marathon. Coming up next, we have Angular. We're going to be talking about accessibility. We have Vue and state management. We have more performance stuff later, sessions later today. So don't go anywhere. And thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.